I grew up in a family with 4 boys and 1 girl. My sister was the oldest of us, and she was always left in charge of us when our parents weren't around. She tried her best to be a good babysitter, but she had 4 boys who didn't like being told what to do, so it was hard to blame her if things ever got out of hand. My parents had bought a house out in the country when my dad got a job in a new state. Unfortunately, it was a good hour or so out of town, so in the summer when my parents were off working, my sister had to deal with the 4 of us every single day. As I mentioned, we didn't exactly take kindly to being told what to do by our older sister, so we would often just leave and go exploring or fishing during the day. I was the 3rd oldest boy, or the 2nd youngest, I guess, depending on which direction you want to count from. On this one summer day when both of our parents were at work as usual, the boys all got together and grabbed our fishing poles. We went out to have a fun day. In this rural area, there was a creek about an hour's walk away from our house that we loved to frequent. We headed out early in the morning and were there before noon. When you fish in a creek, you very rarely catch anything big. On this day though, we didn't really catch anything at all. We had spent hours trying to fish something out, but absolutely nothing was biting. It didn't take long for this to get very boring, and I decided I was just going to wander around a little bit. Only a little while later, I felt a need to go to the restroom, so I went behind a tree to do my thing. When I was just about done though, I suddenly felt a hand fall upon my shoulder. I jumped up in surprise and got a little bit of piss on my shoe. I was about to turn around and swear at whichever brother it was that startled me, but instead when I turned around, I felt those words catch in my throat. I realized it was not any of my brothers. Instead, there was a giant redneck-looking guy standing behind me. He was absolutely huge and wearing overalls as well. He had this gigantic beard. In shock, I tried to move away, but this behemoth grabbed me by the shoulder and held me in place. I struggled to find a way to get away from him. I tried to smack him in the balls, but he was too big for my legs to even reach. He was also able to easily keep me away from him. The worst thing of all, though, happened when he reached into his pocket and pulled out a jackknife. He quickly put the blade of the knife against my neck, and I froze, too scared to even think about doing anything. I just wished my brothers would come looking for me soon. I was too afraid to scream to get their attention, though. The man began asking me who the hell I thought I was and why I was peeing on his property. I wanted to tell him I didn't even know this was his property. I was just out with my brothers fishing, and there were no anti-trespassing signs or anything to indicate the property limits. We didn't know we weren't supposed to be there. The man pressed the knife tightly up against my neck, and I really believed I would be dying right then and there. I even felt a trickle of blood run down my neck when the guy pushed the knife deeper into me, piercing the skin. The man began dragging me, and right when I felt I was just out of luck, I heard footsteps running in the leaves. My 2 older brothers, both big football jocks, yelled at the man to get his damn hands off me. My oldest brother knocked the knife out of his hand easily, and I fell to the ground. Although the man was huge, he was no match for both of my brothers together. I picked up the knife myself and stabbed the guy in his back. The second brother grabbed it from me and threatened the big guy with it further. The man got up and ran away. We hurried back to collect our youngest brother. After that, we ran home the entire way. We thought the man was going to follow us. However, we got home just fine in the end. My sister was pissed off, but when we told her what happened, she called our parents. When my dad came home, we found out the land we were on apparently belonged to the man. When my dad came home, we found out the land we'd been on belonged to the man my dad had bought the house from anyway. When we contacted him, he had no idea who this big guy could be. We described him fully, and the man who owned that property had never seen or found out who he could have been. Alright, so this incident took place in August of 2012. It was my dad's birthday, and we were taking him out deep-sea fishing for a fun activity. My dad owned a yacht, and that was big enough to do this trip. We went out far in the boat. About an hour into the boat ride, we finally stopped in a spot we thought was a good place to get a decent catch. We stopped, and within a few minutes we were set up and fishing away. We had been fishing for about 10 minutes. We'd caught 3 fish or so, I think, all pretty good size. We were interrupted, though, by a noise that sounded similar to another boat coming. We looked to the side, only to see a boat with some guy waving at us. Red flags started going off immediately. I noted at first that this guy did not look anything like a fisherman, and the way his boat looked, it was almost like something you'd find in the dump or something. I noticed he didn't have any fishing gear on him either. I was confused as to what he could be doing this far out at sea. Maybe you're thinking he was just a normal guy out on his boat during a nice ocean ride, but this guy looked like someone who would get into a lot of trouble anyway. Not that I'm trying to be rude by saying that. We waved back at him to give him a quick hello and hoped he would go away after that. Unfortunately, he didn't. He stopped his crappy boat and jumped off into the water, swimming towards our boat. Immediately, we drove away from him, leaving him behind in the wake. We went far enough where he could no longer catch up to us. It would also be quite hard for him to try and find us once he'd swum back to his boat either. That night, we all sailed back to the marina, making sure the guy had not followed us there. Everyone went to bed around 1 a.m., and I was the only one who stayed awake. I was still thinking about that man from earlier. Finally, I started to get some shut-eye for about an hour when I woke up to a notification sound on my phone. I reached under the bed to try and grab it, but I couldn't feel my phone. What I'd grabbed instead was a person's hand. By then, it was already too late. I felt the hand grasp my arm, and I screamed for everyone to get up. My dad came rushing in and pulled a man from underneath the bed. I noticed it was the very same man we'd seen earlier. The fight was over in seconds. My dad beat the man senseless. We called the police and they arrived within minutes, arresting the man soon after. The police and my dad also found his boat in our marina. I don't like describing what they found on that boat. My dad didn't tell me or my friend, but a few days ago when I turned 19, he finally told me what was there. He said he'd gone into the boat accompanied by the police, and the first thing they'd noticed was the smell of a terribly bad odor. Then they saw the body bags. The man was put in prison for life, and I'm grateful to this day I had my dad on that trip with us. My dad saved us from something horrible happening that night, but I've always wondered something. I wonder what would have happened had my phone not made that notification noise and woken me up that night. I like to go fishing in the lakes and rivers in my area. It's a pretty huge area with tons of hills and forests as well. There's a lake in there that's a pretty big fishing and swimming spot. If you take your boat off of the lake though and out into the river, very often you can find yourself very much alone. Every now and then I like to take my boat out on that river and even spend the night on the river as well. The only bad thing about sleeping in a boat is that you can get yourself a real stiff neck by the time morning comes around. A year ago, I had a much more harrowing experience than a stiff neck out on the river. It was the beginning of the fall, and the leaves had mostly turned different colors. They hadn't begun falling out of the trees yet, though. The hills were very beautiful. There weren't many people out on the lake because of the temperature either, so it made sense to go out. School was back in session around that time as well, and parents didn't tend to take their kids out when that was happening. It was cool to me though, because I knew I would have some really good alone time. It didn't take long before I'd found my way out on the river. The lake was mostly empty. The river was completely empty though. I began fishing and had quite a lot more luck than I expected to. Perhaps it was my lucky day. I was so engrossed that I completely lost track of time as I slowly continued to float down the river. The sun began to go down eventually, and I found myself beginning to feel spontaneously creeped out. I wasn't exactly sure why. I'd been in this place many times before all by myself. Perhaps it may have had something to do with how empty the lake was as well. Even when people liked being by themselves and when they liked being lonely, the loneliness can still be frightening if it's too much. I wish I could truly explain what this feeling was like. The sun was just setting behind one of the hills, making the sky a bright orange-pink color. Not only that, but its appearance was blazing behind all those different colored trees on the hill, making the scene look almost like an oil painting. It was nice to see. No words can do that beauty justice. As I continued floating down the river, the sun eventually went fully down. I was left in the dark now. I had some lights on my boat, of course, but only the ones I was legally required to have. The sun was soon replaced by the moon, which was full and bright that night. The light reflected off the river. I don't know how long it had been that I drifted down before I heard a noise come from around me. It wasn't exactly a scream. It was more like an angry, frustrated yell. I perked up and immediately looked in the direction of that sound, and I'll never forget what I saw. I saw two men standing out in the woods, not so deep that I couldn't see them. They looked like they were fighting, but it was a very one-sided fight, at least to me. The bigger man had knocked the smaller man hard upside the head. His body crumpled to the ground. The bigger man then grabbed his arm and dragged his limp body off into the forest. Not once did either man seem to have noticed me though, as far as I knew. I wasn't exactly sure how to react. I was of course shocked, but after a moment I quickly pulled out my cell phone. Of course, it didn't have a signal out here. I cursed a few times and took my boat to the shore. I put down a marker so I would be able to find the area again. I intended to direct the police to it. I wanted to be quiet as well, because I didn't want that man to come back. After placing the marker, I got back in my boat and tried to get back to the lake area. I kept as far from the man's side of the shore as I could. After a few minutes though, something caught my eye. I looked back at the shore, and I was sure I could see some movement there. I couldn't quite make out what it was though. I got back to the lake area eventually, and went past the parking lot area to the dock. My truck was one of only 2 vehicles in the lot. There was one other truck, and it was now parked right beside mine. I could have sworn I saw someone sitting in the front seat quickly duck down as I approached. I checked my phone again to see I had a single bar. I quickly called the police and remained out on the lake until they arrived. They arrested the guy who was hiding in the truck, who'd confessed to getting into a fight with his brother before knocking him out. He had seen me in the boat and drove to the parking lot in order to make sure I kept my mouth shut. Fortunately, unlike the man initially thought, his brother had only been injured and was not dead. The man was still arrested, and I had to go to court for several months after that to testify. I grew up in a small town, total population of maybe 2,000 or so. Everyone knew everyone else, or at least knew your family members. It was a safe town with mostly middle-class working families. Nothing major ever happened, and the crime rates were low as well. Because of this, I grew up feeling safe and secure. To note, I grew up in the 90s as well. One summer day, my good friend Jenny and I were out for a bike ride. We were around 12 or 11 years old. We were allowed to bike anywhere we wanted, as long as we didn't leave town and wore our helmets. There was a new road being constructed in between the 2 main neighborhoods. The new road was to provide a shorter way of accessing the main one to get to the next town. At the time, it was still under construction but very nearly complete. All that was left was paving and painting. Jenny and I decided to bike down the gravel road. Jenny and I were about halfway down. The road was about 1 kilometer long or so. At the halfway point, we noticed a man out walking. He appeared to be in his early 30s and seemed very handsome. I didn't recognize the man from around town, and neither did Jenny either. As we got closer, he broke out a big smile and waved hello. We said hello back, as he didn't seem threatening or scary. He asked us if we were having a good summer so far. He told Jenny and I he was a photographer from a nearby city and was in town to scout out some models for his new postcard company. Jenny and I apparently had very beautiful features. He said we could be models for him. He asked if he could take our pictures. He said we had the exact look he wanted, and the scenery right now was just perfect to promote the town. He knew he would sell tons of postcards, and we could all make some money for ourselves. Jenny and I eagerly agreed. He got us to stand with our hands on our hips and a big smile. He took a disposable camera out of his back pocket and began snapping photos. He took about 10 in total, from many different angles. I remember feeling pretty uneasy at some point and said we should probably leave because we needed to be home soon. The man then said he would get in touch with our principal on the first day of school to give us some money from the postcard sales. We foolishly confirmed the local elementary school we went to, although it was also the only elementary school in town, so I guess it wouldn't have been hard to figure out either way. Neither of us gave him our names though, which is important for later. Jenny and I talked about becoming famous on the way home. I brought up to Jenny though that I wondered why he didn't have a professional camera if he was a photographer. She said she'd wondered that too, but cameras are pretty expensive, so maybe he didn't have a nice one with him, in case it rained or something. That evening at supper, I told my parents about my new potential fame as well. They were horrified and got on the phone with Jenny's parents right away. The two sets of them called the police and gave statements. The police downplayed it, saying it was unusual but nothing criminal had technically happened. My parents gave us both a long lecture about safety, as did Jenny's parents, making an awesome total of 2 parental lectures. The following spring, Jenny and I were hanging out together, this time a little older and a little wiser, a lot more cautious as well. We were walking along a quiet side street, talking about music and TV shows. At this point, a minivan suddenly approached us and slowed down. A friendly-looking woman asked us if we knew where Smith's Road was. We told her she just needed to drive straight for less than a minute, and it's the first right-hand turn. She said she was having difficulty finding it though, and asked if we minded hopping in and showing her. Instantly, I said no this time. Jenny also declined. To our surprise, the woman then said it was okay, because she knew who we were. She called us both by first name, and said she'd seen us on a postcard. By now, we were both freaked out. We were on a stretch of the road that had no houses, and the nearest one was 100 meters away. It wasn't common for people to have cell phones back then, so neither Jenny or I had one. The woman continued to insist we get in her van. Jenny, who was normally super chatty, was staring into the vehicle intensely. Her body language was stiff, and I could tell she was scared. Suddenly, and seemingly out of nowhere, Jenny screamed for us to run. I didn't know what she'd seen, but I followed behind and ran as well. We ran off the road, through a field and into a yard another street over. I recognized this house as belonging to a school teacher. We pounded on her door and thankfully she answered. We told her what happened as well. Jenny then said something I'll never forget. She said she'd seen that very same photographer man from last summer crouching down and hiding behind the back row of seats. In that moment, she knew something bad was going to happen. The police and our parents were called. We gave statements and a vehicle description, as well as descriptions of the man and woman. Unfortunately, the police were never able to locate them. Jenny and I never saw the man or the woman again after. We had some serious trust issues with strangers after those encounters, and I had nightmares of being kidnapped all the way into early adulthood. Always make sure to teach your children that strangers are not safe, no matter how nice they seem. My situation could have had a much more unfortunate outcome if things had gone even slightly differently.